So what is the difference between Eastern and Western knitting? Um, it is actually that it's a different stitch construction. Most of the styles that you've heard of, probably continental American, Norwegian, Portuguese, they're all a Western method. The stitch construction is the same on all of them. You hold the yarn differently or maybe the needles differently, but the stitch construction is the same. Eastern knitting, the actual stitch construction is different. And so the way that it's different is in both how you wrap the yarn when you're going to make your stitch and then how you actually knit the stitch on your left hand needle. So with Western methods, you're always going to be wrapping the yarn in a counterclockwise motion like this around the needle as you knit. And of course, this doesn't necessarily look like knitting at the moment. When you're knitting, you're going to have a bunch of fabric and loops below this, but this is the motion that your yarn is taking on your right hand needle as you knit. And so with Western knitting, this is the construction, and you'll see that that's a spiral that goes from top right to bottom left. And what that means is that when you switch it over to your left hand to continue knitting in your left hand, you've got the right hand leg of the stitch is forward on the needle, and the left hand leg is backwards. You see how that's doing that? It's creating that kind of a lean. And what that does, it makes it very simple to go in through the front of the stitch in order to make your knit stitch. Eastern style knitting is the opposite. When you're wrapping your yarn around your needle, you're going to go in a clockwise motion and wrap it in a clockwise motion like this. And you'll see that that creates an opposite leaning spiral. It's going from top left to bottom right. Okay, and what that does when you move it, when your stitching goes to your left hand needle, that makes it so that the back of the back leg of the stitch is forward on the needle and the front leg of the stitch is backwards. And what that means is that it is very simple to go in the back of the stitch to make your knit stitch. And that is the inherent difference. Western styles all will go through the front of the stitch, and Eastern goes through the back of the stitch. And the wrap construction assists you in that, whether you're doing the Western or the Eastern. Okay, so that is it. That is the difference between Western method and Eastern method. And here I have a couple of examples for you of little pieces that I've already knit. So you can see, oh, that one came off, but you can see here that the back leg of the stitch is just a little bit forward than the front leg. You can kind of see that top left leaning spiral. This is Eastern construction. Okay, and this needle is Western construction, and you can see that that front leg is pulling forward on your stitches. Right? You see that? So that is the difference. But you'll notice that when the two of them are side by side, you can't tell. You really can't tell which style was used. They do make exactly the same stitches. The only time that Eastern style perhaps gets in a little bit of the way with Western patterns is if a Western pattern calls for knitting through the back of the stitch, because then of course if you're doing Eastern style you're already knitting through the back of the stitch. But if you're just doing, you know, knit stitch, purl stitch, yarn overs, those kinds of things, they all function exactly the same way. So you can knit any pattern in the Eastern style that you could in the Western style. So that is it, the difference between Eastern and Western knitting.